The sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the vast expanse of the desert planet of Selvaris. The air shimmered with heat, making the landscape look like an abstract painting, swirling sand dunes and jagged rocks mingling with the occasional clump of sparse vegetation. But the most noticeable thing about this world wasn't its barren beauty or its treacherous terrain, it was the looming structure in the distance, half sunk in the desert sands. At first glance, it appeared to be an ancient ruin, but to anyone who knew better, it was so much more. The artifacts strewn across the land, the strange symbols on the structure, and the energy readings emanating from the location made it one of the most coveted and dangerous sites in the galaxy. This was the legendary Treasures of Paradise, an alien relic, long thought to be myth. Those who believed in it, mostly treasure hunters and adventure seekers, had risked their lives for centuries in search of its riches, and now a small group of explorers, led by a fiery, unrelenting woman, were on the brink of uncovering it. This was Zora Albright's big break. Zora stood at the edge of the encampment, gazing out at the ruin. She adjusted her goggles, the sunburnt skin on her face pulled tight in concentration. Her dark hair was tied back in a rough ponytail, sweat clinging to her brow. She wasn't a stranger to dangerous expeditions, but there was something about this one, something in the air that made her skin tingle. It wasn't just the promise of unimaginable wealth that drove her, it was the idea of proving herself, of showing the galaxy that humans were more than just a footnote in the history of space exploration. They were capable of greatness. Beside her, her second-in-command, a lanky ex-soldier named Jace, looked up at the horizon with an equal measure of determination and skepticism. He had seen his fair share of dead ends, and while Zora's optimism was infectious, he knew that most treasure hunts ended in tragedy or disappointment. "You really think this is it?" Jace asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and doubt. He adjusted the pack on his back, which was filled with everything from climbing gear to a portable scanner for reading energy signatures. It was the standard kit for a professional, but even he wasn't sure what they were dealing with here. Zora didn't turn to look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the ruin, her fingers twitching at the controls of the scanner in her hand. She was about to answer when the voice of their tech specialist, Dax, buzzed through the comm link. His voice was typically calm, almost disinterested, but today there was an unusual edge to it. "Zora, you might want to check this out," Dax said. She turned her head to the side, signaling Jace to follow her as she made her way toward the small hovercraft they had parked at the edge of the camp. Dax was sitting inside, looking over a series of holographic readouts that were projected from his tablet. The screen showed a blurry but distinct energy pattern emanating from the depths of the ruin. "Yeah, that's not a glitch," Dax continued, tapping a few controls. The image cleared, revealing a pulsating sphere-like shape, embedded deep within the ruin. It radiated with an eerie glow, and though the shape seemed inert, the energy readings suggested something far more dangerous. Zora narrowed her eyes, leaning over his shoulder. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Dax's eyes flicked to her. "I've never seen anything like it, but the signature matches nothing in our database. Could be an alien artifact, something the previous explorers missed, or something that was deliberately hidden." The idea of something hidden within the ruin both thrilled and terrified Zora. There was always something in these ancient sites, something hidden for a reason. The fact that this energy source had gone unnoticed until now made her uneasy. It was too perfect, too obvious. If they had missed it, surely someone else had. "You think it's connected to the treasures?" Jace asked, folding his arms over his chest. "It has to be," Zora said, standing tall. "This is it, the thing we've been chasing all these years. The treasures of paradise. We're not leaving here without them." A series of sharp beeps interrupted her thoughts. Dax's fingers hovered over the console, clearly rattled. Guys, we have a problem." "What do you mean?" Zora asked, her attention snapping back to him. "We're not alone," Dax muttered, tapping a few more commands on his tablet. The screen flickered, showing what appeared to be two dark figures in the distance, moving toward the ruin at an alarming rate. Zora instinctively reached for her blaster at her side, her fingers grazing the cool metal. "More treasure hunters?" Jace asked, his voice low and tense. Could be. But these guys are moving fast, Dax replied. He zoomed in on the figures, revealing that they were not just fast, they were fast and heavily armed. A shiver ran down Zora's spine. Not just any treasure hunters, she murmured. Mercenaries. And if they're here, they've got a bigger stake in this than we do. Her mind raced. The stakes had just skyrocketed. They were no longer dealing with a simple treasure hunt, they were up against a force capable of wiping them out before they even set foot in the ruin. They needed to move fast, faster than anyone else could react. Zora's voice was sharp and commanding. Get the hovercraft ready. We're going in now. Dax, I need a full map of that structure. Anything you can pull up, any security systems, traps, whatever you've got, we need to know. I'm on it, Dax replied, quickly typing commands into his tablet. You're sure this is the right move? We can try to outmaneuver them, make a plan. Zora didn't wait for him to finish. She was already strapping herself into the hovercraft's seat. There's no time to waste. We don't get a second chance with something like this. The hovercraft roared to life, lifting off the sand with a sudden burst of speed. The wind whipped at their faces as they zoomed across the desert, the mercenaries' figures growing larger in their rear view. The ruin loomed ever closer, an ancient mystery waiting to be uncovered, but also a deadly trap. As the craft skidded to a stop at the base of the ruin, Zora leapt out, her boots sinking slightly into the hot sand. Jace followed closely behind, his weapon drawn, scanning the surroundings for any sign of the mercenaries. They were close now, too close for comfort. The structure, once distant and dreamlike, now towered over them. It was a marvel of alien engineering, its surface sleek and metallic, adorned with strange symbols and hidden seams. Ready? Zora asked, her voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. Jace gave a grim nod, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. Just keep your head on a swivel. Zora glanced at Dax, who had already begun setting up his equipment. The tension in the air was palpable, time was running out. Every second they delayed meant a greater risk of facing the mercenaries on their own terms. This is it, Zora muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible against the howl of the wind. This is our shot. The first steps into the ruin felt heavier than any she had taken before. They were entering the unknown now, entering something that might bring them glory, wealth, or destruction. It was impossible to know which. The air inside the structure was cool, a stark contrast to the searing desert heat outside. Their footsteps echoed off the smooth, polished walls. Zora couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was the treasures of paradise, the culmination of centuries of myth and legend. And they were about to discover what lay within. But even as they ventured deeper into the heart of the ruin, a foreboding feeling gnawed at Zora. The mercenaries were closing in fast. They would have to outsmart them, outmaneuver them, and rely on more than just their strength and skill to make it out alive. The air inside the ruin grew colder as Zora and her team ventured deeper, their footsteps reverberating against the smooth, alien walls. It was like walking through the corridors of an ancient, forgotten god's temple. The walls were adorned with carvings, faint, luminous symbols that pulsed and shifted as if alive. They illuminated the narrow passageways in hues of blue and gold, casting eerie shadows in every direction. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of their equipment and the occasional drip of condensation from the high, vaulted ceilings. The sense of awe from moments ago had shifted into an unsettling feeling of anticipation, like they were being watched by an unseen presence. Zora, always the leader, forced her nerves to stay steady. She glanced back to check on her team. Jace was crouched low, scanning the corridor for any signs of danger with a practiced eye. Dax, for his part, seemed completely absorbed in his device, fingers moving furiously over the touchpad as he studied the holographic map. The urgency of their mission was clear in his posture, his furrowed brow, but there was also a hint of fascination. Even he, the eternal cynic, couldn't deny the strange allure of the ruin. "We're getting closer," Dax murmured, his voice low but intense. "Energy readings are spiking." Whatever's ahead, it's definitely not just a treasure chamber. Zora's eyes narrowed. They'd been chasing this for too long to get distracted now. Keep your focus. We don't need a science lesson right now. We need a way in. Dax nodded without looking up, his fingers still flicking across the tablet's interface. I'm trying to pinpoint the exact location of the artifact. It's buried deep in the core of this place. Suddenly, a faint, distant rumble echoed through the passage, followed by a loud scraping noise from somewhere above. Zora froze, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. Jace's hand immediately went to the grip of his blaster, his eyes scanning the high vaults. What was that? Jace whispered, voice tight with suspicion. Zora didn't answer immediately. She took a step forward, scanning the ceiling above them, half expecting to see the shadowed figures of mercenaries drop down from the vents. The sound had come from above, but there were no immediate signs of life. The stone around them was unnervingly silent, the only noise now the subtle hum of Dax's scanner. Could be structural instability, Dax suggested, though his tone betrayed his doubt. This place is ancient. Zora didn't buy it. The rumble had been deliberate, too calculated. She glanced back toward the entrance they had come through. The path leading back seemed to stretch impossibly long in her mind. They had made it too far to turn back now, but she couldn't shake the sense that they weren't alone in this ruin. The mercenaries were still out there, getting closer. She knew it was only a matter of time before they would converge on this very spot. The stakes had shifted, this was no longer about treasure alone. It was about survival. Dax, Zora said, her voice sharp. Focus. We need to move faster. The mercenaries are closing in. We need to reach that artifact before they do. Dax hesitated for only a moment. Right. Almost there, he replied, tapping a few more commands into his device. His face paled slightly as the map shifted on the holographic display, revealing a set of complicated symbols near the core of the structure. I'm picking up something strange. The artifact, it's locked behind a set of energy gates? Like a force field. Zora's heart skipped a beat. She had heard rumors of traps and defenses built into the ruins by the ancients, but this was different. A force field? She glanced down at the blaster holstered at her side. Guns wouldn't get them through this. They would need something far more creative. Any way to bypass it? She asked, keeping her voice calm. I'm not sure, Dax admitted, his brow furrowing in concentration. The energy patterns are unlike anything I've seen. If it's a security system, it's, well, advanced. But there's something odd. It seems to be reacting to the presence of life forms. Like it knows we're here. The implications of that hit Zora like a punch to the gut. The structure was alive, in some way, and it had noticed them. We can't waste time, Zora said, forcing her mind into problem-solving mode. Can you find an alternate route to bypass the gate? Dax nodded, his eyes scanning the map again. There's another passage to the east. It's narrower, but it should lead directly to the artifact without triggering the force field. I think. Zora turned to Jace. You heard him. We're moving out. Without hesitation, the team turned to the east passage. The walls seemed to close in on them as they walked deeper into the ruins. The air grew heavier, tinged with an ancient, musty scent that made Zora's stomach churn. The path was cramped, forcing them to move in a tight formation. Every step echoed through the narrow tunnel, and Zora could hear her own breath, shallow and quick. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from behind them, followed by another tremor. The ground beneath their feet jolted violently. Dax stumbled, barely managing to keep his balance. Zora's heart raced. The tremor wasn't natural, it was a warning. They weren't just being watched anymore. They were being herded. They're coming, Jace muttered under his breath, his voice laced with tension. Zora's thoughts raced. The mercenaries weren't the only threat here. Whoever had built this ruin had left behind defenses, and they were already in motion. They had no time to spare. Move faster. Zora barked, quickening her pace. Jace was already ahead of her, his blaster raised and ready. Dax, despite his usual calm demeanor, was now visibly rattled, his fingers hovering nervously over his scanner. They were close, too close. The passage twisted and turned, the walls seeming to constrict as they neared the artifact's location. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became. It felt like the entire ruin was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Then, they reached the final corner. Ahead, a massive door loomed, its surface covered in the same shifting symbols that adorn the walls. The door seemed almost organic, as if it had grown into place rather than being constructed. At its center was a large, intricate locking mechanism, which pulsed with the same unnatural energy that had permeated the ruin from the start. "We're here," Dax whispered, his voice awestruck. He stepped forward, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the device in his belt, a makeshift hacking tool. This should work. But we need more time." Zora glanced behind her. The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the passages. They weren't alone. "They're right behind us," she said. "Dax, do whatever it takes." Dax nodded, his face drawn tight in concentration. He activated the device and began working quickly, his hands moving with precision, but the lock seemed to resist him. The symbols on the door shifted, as if responding to his touch, their glowing patterns growing more erratic. Zora's fingers curled around the grip of her blaster as she took a step back, positioning herself near the entrance. Her mind raced, how could they hold off the mercenaries long enough for Dax to crack the code? The sound of boots pounding against the stone floors grew louder. They didn't have much time left. "There's no turning back now," she muttered under her breath, as the last part of the lock clicked into place. With a low rumble, the door began to open, slowly at first. Behind her, the mercenaries were closing in. Zora's hand hovered over her blaster, ready for what was to come. The real treasure wasn't just inside the ruin, it was surviving long enough to claim it. The massive door rumbled open with a slow, metallic groan, revealing a dark chamber beyond. The air inside was thick with tension, the faint hum of unseen mechanisms vibrating through the walls. The moment the door fully opened, Zora didn't hesitate. She signaled to Jace, her sharp eyes scanning the narrow entrance. The mercenaries were close, too close to give them any breathing room. "Go!" Zora shouted. Jace was already moving, his blaster raised, his senses alert. He darted inside the chamber first, scanning for threats, every muscle in his body tense. Zora followed closely, her breath steady but her heart hammering in her chest. Dax was last, moving more slowly, his fingers still dancing over his device, barely glancing up at the chamber as the door slid closed behind him with a final, ominous thud. They were inside, but so were their enemies. Zora's eyes darted around the dark room. The space was vast, an immense, hollowed-out cavern with walls that shimmered with strange, swirling patterns. The glow from the symbols on the walls illuminated the area in eerie blues and greens. At the far end of the chamber, a pedestal stood, tall and imposing, with an alien artifact resting atop it, a sphere of smooth, translucent material that pulsed with the same energy they'd seen in the ruins' readings. It was magnificent, almost hypnotic in its beauty, but Zora's attention didn't linger on the artifact for long. "Dax, any luck with the system?" she asked, her voice sharp, eyes flicking to the shadows creeping at the edges of the chamber. She could almost feel the presence of the mercenaries outside. Dax was already on the move, tapping furiously at his device. "I'm accessing the system," he muttered, his face pale with concentration. "But there's more here than I anticipated. Some kind of defensive protocol. This might be harder to hack than I thought." Zora cursed under her breath. They had no time. The mercenaries were already at the entrance, and the rumbling from the deeper recesses of the ruin had become a distant thunder, threatening to shake the entire structure apart. Jace grunted, raising his weapon as he moved into a defensive position, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the chamber. "We're not going to have long before they figure out where we are. We need to hold them off, or we're done." Zora nodded, but her mind was racing. They had to reach the artifact, But first, they had to deal with the mercenaries. Her fingers twitched at her side, itching for the comfort of her blaster, but there was something far more urgent in the air. A low growl of static filled the comm link, followed by a voice that made her stomach tighten. "Zora Albright," a voice rasped. "You've led us on quite a chase. But it's over now." She recognized the voice immediately. The leader of the mercenaries, a tall, imposing figure with a reputation for ruthlessness, Thorn. He had been hunting them for days, tracking their every move. And now, they were at his mercy. "Not today, Thorn," Zora responded, her voice as steady as she could manage. She glanced at Jace and Dax, silently signaling them to take their positions. Thorn's voice crackled again, filled with amusement. "Oh, I think so. You've come all this way, and for what? A shiny rock? You think that's worth your lives?" The air crackled with tension. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. Zora's instincts screamed that the situation was about to escalate, but she needed to know exactly where the mercenaries were before they made their move. She pressed a finger to her earpiece, trying to tap into any available feeds from their equipment. But the interference was intense. Whoever Thorn had on his side was good at jamming signals. Then, without warning, the chamber's lights flickered. The low rumbling sound increased in intensity, reverberating through the floor beneath their feet. Something was happening, and it wasn't just the mercenaries getting closer. "What the hell is that?" Dax said, his voice tight with alarm. The walls of the chamber began to shift, and the floor trembled. The shimmering patterns on the walls began to rearrange, the smooth surface crackling with energy as bright, neon blue lines appeared, tracing intricate, circuit-like paths along the stone. Zora's eyes widened as she understood. It wasn't just the mercenaries who were a threat now. The ruin itself had activated, responding to their presence. The walls pulsed and groaned, and the ground beneath their feet rumbled, growing louder, as though the structure itself were coming to life. "We need to move," Zora snapped, eyes darting to the pedestal at the far end of the room. The artifact was still there, glowing more intensely now. The force field surrounding it, if that's what it was, hadn't yet activated, but it would soon. But the mercenaries were also moving in, and Thorn's voice came through the comms again, mocking and smooth. "You've got nowhere to go, Albright. This place is mine now. I suggest you make this easy." Zora's grip tightened around her blaster, and she exchanged a quick look with Jace. The mercenaries were closing in from all sides now, creeping through the shadows, their footfalls almost drowned out by the noise of the chamber itself. But she could still sense them, the faint whisper of motion, the subtle shuffle of boots on stone. They had no idea what they were up against. "We don't need to make it easy," Zora muttered, and without another word, she surged forward, leading the way. Jace followed, moving quickly, instinctively staying close. The force field had begun to flicker, a low hum filling the air as it began to charge up. Zora couldn't risk waiting any longer. She needed to reach the artifact first. But as she reached the pedestal, a loud crash rang out from behind them. Thorn had entered the chamber, and the mercenaries weren't far behind. Zora turned just in time to see the first mercenary burst into the room, weapon raised, ready to fire. Without thinking, she ducked behind a column, drawing her blaster in a smooth, practiced motion. A shot rang out, narrowly missing her, but the force of it sent a wave of heat through the air. She returned fire, her aim sharp, and the mercenary collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground. "Keep them back!" Zora shouted, her voice urgent. She heard Jace's blaster firing from the opposite side of the chamber, and the sound of metal clashing against metal echoed in the enclosed space. The mercenaries were trying to flank them, but they weren't the only ones who had prepared for a fight. The walls of the chamber had activated now, glowing with energy, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. The once pristine floor was now uneven, and jagged rocks jutted out from the ground as the ruins seemed to grow more hostile by the second. Dax was still at the pedestal, his fingers flying over his device, trying to access whatever system controlled the force field. Sweat dripped from his brow as the lights above flickered erratically. "I'm almost in," Dax grunted, his voice strained. Just hold on a little longer. Zora knew they didn't have much time. The mercenaries were closing in from all sides. Thorn was there, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. She could hear his voice now, echoing off the walls, his words as cold as the steel in his voice. You can't win this. We have the upper hand. Zora's heart pounded, adrenaline rushing through her veins. She glanced quickly at Dax, his eyes locked on the screen in front of him. The force field shimmered, but it wasn't fully activated. If they could just buy a few more seconds. A mercenary lunged at her from the side, but before he could react, Jace took him out with a quick, clean shot. Zora didn't even flinch, her focus never wavering. The artifact was within reach, but the mercenaries weren't going down without a fight. With a final surge of effort, Dax let out a triumphant shout. The force field flickered once, and then deactivated. The pedestal was theirs. But Thorn's voice came through again, sharper this time. You're out of time, Albright. The structure will bury you alive. And then, the ground beneath their feet began to rumble once more. This was no longer just about treasure. It was about survival. The tremor that shook the chamber felt like it came from the depths of the planet itself. The ground heaved beneath their feet, and a low, ominous groan reverberated through the walls. Zora's heart pounded as the room seemed to close in on them. The ruin wasn't just a trap, it was an active, living entity, and it had been waiting for this moment. The walls shifted, the stone groaning as if it were alive, responding to their intrusion, to their very presence. Thorn's voice crackled through the comms again, this time filled with triumph and malevolence. You've taken the bait, Albright. But it's over. This place is rigged to implode. You can't escape. Zora's pulse quickened as she glanced over her shoulder. The mercenaries were still scattered around the room, taking up positions. They were closing in, their weapons drawn, their eyes gleaming with the certainty of victory. But Zora didn't feel defeated. No, something had clicked in her mind, a sense of clarity that had been missing until now. The artifact, whatever it was in her hands. The force field was down. It was the key. She could feel it. We don't need to escape, Zora said, her voice cool and steady, though her mind was racing. She reached out to touch the artifact, her fingers brushing the surface of the translucent orb. The moment she made contact, a pulse of energy shot through her body, a jolt that made her entire frame tense with raw power. Her vision blurred for a moment, and she could almost hear a voice in the back of her mind, ancient, powerful, and distant. The artifact was alive. It was no mere treasure. It was a weapon, a key to the ruin itself. Dax, who had been beside her, stepped back, his eyes wide. What's happening? What did you do? Zora didn't answer him. She was too focused on the sensation that had surged through her body. The artifact seemed to hum in her grip, and she realized something that sent a shockwave through her system. This wasn't just an ancient artifact, it was a conduit. The ruin's systems were linked to it, and she was now linked to the ruin. The room around them was becoming more unstable by the second. The walls groaned louder, and the floor was buckling in places. But Zora wasn't panicking. If she could control the artifact, if she could unlock its potential, she could control the ruin itself. Dax, I need you to help me. Can you override the systems from here? She asked, her voice sharp. Dax was staring at her, eyes wide in disbelief. He didn't respond at first, too stunned by the rapid shifts in the room and the eerie energy emanating from the artifact. But after a beat, his fingers flew over his device, trying to stabilize the systems remotely. I don't know, Zora. I've never seen anything like this before. If we don't do something soon, the whole place is going to collapse. Zora didn't flinch. Then we better hurry. With every second that passed, the danger escalated. Thorn's mercenaries were still approaching, but now Zora's mind was flooded with new information, unlocking pathways she didn't understand at first. The artifact had given her insight into the ruin's design, its very architecture, and now she was starting to comprehend its mechanisms, its defense systems. She could manipulate it. She could stop it. Focus, Zora. Jace's voice snapped her out of her concentration. He was still covering their back, his blaster in hand, eyes darting from one side of the room to the other as the mercenaries slowly circled. Zora gave him a curt nod, her gaze never leaving the artifact. She raised it in front of her, the glowing sphere pulsing in her hands, and concentrated. Slowly, carefully, she willed it to release the energy inside, to connect her mind with the ruined systems. The artifact responded. The ground beneath them shook again, but this time, Zora felt a surge of control, a power she hadn't realized she was capable of wielding. The energy in the walls began to realign, the glowing symbols on the walls flickering before shifting back into place, as if the ruin itself was responding to her command. She could feel it now, the ruin was listening. She turned to Dax, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me you can't override the defense systems." "I'll do it myself." Dax stared at her, his face pale. "Zora, you're crazy. You don't know what that thing can do." But Zora didn't hesitate. She was already drawing on the power of the artifact, focusing the energy that flowed through it into the ruin's control matrix. The walls groaned, the ground shaking harder now, but the artifact hummed louder in her hands, as if it was alive, resonating with the ruin itself. And then, with a final push, she sent a wave of energy coursing through the chamber, flooding the walls, the floors, and the ceiling with raw power. The ruin stopped. The shaking ceased, and the loud groan of the ancient structure faded into eerie silence. The mercenaries froze. Thorn, standing at the rear of the group, stared at Zora in disbelief, his hand frozen mid-reach for his weapon. For a moment, no one moved. Zora stood tall, breathing heavily but in control. The artifact was still glowing in her hands, but it no longer felt like an alien force. It was now an extension of her will, as natural as breathing. "Listen to me, Thorn," Zora said, her voice unwavering. "You're in my domain now. You want the artifact? You're going to have to earn it." Thorn took a step forward, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you can control this place, Albright? You think you can stop us?" Zora smiled, though her eyes burned with intensity. "I don't need to stop you. I just need to make sure you never get your hands on the artifact. You're out of time. Leave now, or I'll make sure you never leave this place." There was a tense silence. Zora could feel the weight of Thorn's gaze on her, but she didn't falter. The ruin was hers now. She had claimed it. Thorn looked at his men, who stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had no backup, no way to defeat an ancient force like this. Thorn himself was a skilled tactician, but even he couldn't have predicted Zora would control the very ruin they had hoped to plunder. With a snarl, Thorn gestured for his men to fall back. "This isn't over, Albright. You're playing with fire. Mark my words." He retreated, pulling his team back, and for the first time in a long while, Zora felt the weight of the situation shift. They were safe. For now. As the mercenaries vanished into the depths of the ruin, Zora allowed herself a brief moment to breathe. She turned to her team. Dax, who was staring at her in awe, and Jace, who had a half-smile on his face despite the tension. "Nice job," Jace said, his voice light, though he was still scanning the room for any remaining threats. Zora smirked, lowering the artifact. "We're not out of here yet, Jace. Let's get this thing back to the ship, and then we can celebrate. It's time to go home." Dax shook his head, still processing what had just happened. "I can't believe you did that. You just hacked into an alien ruin, and," he paused, glancing at the artifact in her hand, "you became part of it. What does that mean for us? What does it mean for you?" Zora's eyes softened as she looked at the glowing sphere in her hand. The power within it, the potential, was limitless. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: they had survived. They had overcome, as they always did, and they had walked away from the treasure of paradise with more than just riches. They had claimed control over a force older than time itself. With a final glance around the chamber, Zora gave a nod. "It means we're not done yet. Not by a long shot." And with that, they turned toward the exit. The ruin, which had once threatened to destroy them, was now a tool, one they had tamed. As they left the chamber, Zora's thoughts shifted to the future. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. With her team at her back and the artifact in hand, she was ready for anything. This was only the beginning.